This is my second time at Bridges. I believe the first time was Miami 3 or 4 years ago, where I introduced, some of you probably were there, where I introduced the phrase kitchen porn. We're going to try and stay away from kitchen porn, but I thought I'd open with a video because that's the oldest trick in the book in public speaking. You open with a video and now you're 2 minutes down and only 28 to go. This is not one of those big corporate rah-rah videos. It's a video we're very proud of, and I'm kind of hoping it tells you more about who we are than any amount of statistics and slides. There'll be some of those as well, but I'd like to kind of set the mood here. The video really is about who we are, why we do what we do. Now, answering that question, why you do what you do, is really easy if you work for the Red Cross or Doctors Without Borders or last year Tom's with Blake McCoskey's incredible presentation. It's a much more difficult question to answer when you make washing machines. Like, why do we do this? What is the good that we do for the world? So if we run the video, I'm kind of hoping that maybe we can get the answer to it. I found the answer to it in there. So can we run the video, please? It really is only 2 minutes. If you've all finished drying your eyes now, we'll talk about all the stuff that needs to happen behind the scenes in order to create those wonderful life-affirming moments and shaping life for the better. So if the clicker works, let's start here. We're supply chain professionals. We live in a whole lot of worlds. The first part of our world starts with sales forecasts, which are, as you all know, best used for flooring cattle cars. There was a gentleman from Johnson & Johnson once who taught me that there are only two kinds of sales forecasts in the world: lucky and wrong. And I don't know about you guys out there, but we seem to find ourselves in the wrong end a lot. And those sales forecasts are, of course, made much more complicated because, as Dror said, you know, we manufacture our stuff in all the wrong places and then we send it to the other side of the world. And that's no different from Electrolux. In fact, you're going to hear an awful lot from me about what Dror said. Here's a really interesting chart. It blew our CEO's mind when I showed it to him. The yellow line is the Electrolux revenue over a 10-year period. We are a $15 to $17 billion company, depending on the exchange rate to the Swedish krona and a few ups and downs in the world economy. And we've been a $15 to $17 billion company for 10 years. In fact, probably for longer, but this is the years I had the shipping data for. The blue line is the number of TEU that we have shipped over the same period, of the development TEU. So we have gone from something like 45,000 TEU to, actually this year, we're probably going to pass the 200,000 TEU mark. But our top line has not changed by more than a few $100 million, while our shipping profile has exploded. And that basically is, in one chart with two simple lines, the picture of globalization. This is what happens when you close factories in low-cost countries, or high-cost countries. You move them to low-cost countries, you start discovering that you can buy stuff really cheaply in China, but you still send it to Europe. Our shipping pattern is actually not dependent on the world economy. There is no correlation. On the contrary, when the world economy tanks like it did in 2009, our volumes explode because everybody involved in our supply chain and on the procurement side of things discovered that now they have to go even further afield to find stuff cheaper and easier and in bigger volume. Interesting chart. I promised you statistics. Here are statistics. This is the world I live in. So it's a complex world. 200,000 TEU, $15 billion in goods value, 43 factories, lots of air freight, lots of LCL, ridiculous amounts of money spent on trucking and rail. You know all the story. But the really interesting one is that big bubble on the right there. Every single day, somewhere in the world, 1.5 billion people will, at some point during their day, hopefully one of those beautiful ones we saw in the video, be using one of our products. And that's the installed base, in addition to the 60 million products we add to the installed base every year. Of course, those need to be serviced in the highly unlikely event that they break down, and we need to move spare parts, we need to move replacements, we need to figure out how to run this incredible mixture of supply chain challenges. It's a dangerous world. These are some examples. This one also blew the mind of our CEO. I love doing that. And at least he's open to having his mind blown, unlike some CEOs, so that's cool. These are just a small sample of all the catastrophes that have befallen Electrolux containers over the last 6-7 years all over the world. We got earthquakes, we've got tsunamis, we've got ash clouds, we had floodings in Thailand, we had the US West Coast shut down for 6 or 7 months. We have had fires, we have had collisions, we have had engine trouble, we had a ship that broke in half. Well, it wasn't ours, the ship that broke in half, the MOL down close to South Africa. These things happen every single day somewhere in the world, and we're present in 190 countries, so the probability that something's going to go wrong today is ridiculously high. And don't even get me started, oh shoot, on Hanjin and Maersk. I didn't have a big enough map to put in all the trouble that caused us, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that too, although you covered it, and George's story is very similar to mine. It's a changing world, and we're not going to go through all these bullet points because we don't have all the time, but B2C is a big game changer for us now. We have traditionally been a big box retailer kind of supplier, so here in the US that would be Sears, Lowe's, Home Depot, Best Buy, Costco, Walmart, plus of course all the niche like the Crate and Barrels and people like that. But B2C is becoming a big deal for us now. We're moving into that space very quickly, both under our own power and via Amazon, and in some of the acquisitions we've made recently. That instant feedback from customers via social media has of course put even more pressure on our ability to deliver service when something goes wrong, because otherwise you find out about it really quickly. It can have huge impacts on your brand in a way that wasn't possible 10 years ago. So we all, well, just think United Airlines and you'll know what I'm talking about, right? Data by fire hose, and a lot of panelists and speakers have touched on this. You can have the most astonishing amount of data, but what do you really need, right? And at what cost? Because the cost to get a lot of this data back, especially talking about the Internet of Things from connected appliances, etc. How much of that data do you really want back? Because it is not cheap to get it back, and it is not cheap to store it, and it is not cheap to process it. So these are some of the things we're wrestling with. And then of course you got that functionality versus security and privacy. You know, Dror talked about using a little camera to see whether his container has been offloaded. But think about connected appliances. Think about Alexa that many people have touched on now. Think about how connected your home is going to be in the next 5 to 10 years. And I've seen a demonstration of a hacker going in through a Wi-Fi enabled oven and using that access to your home to unlock your smart fingerprint controlled front door. All right, so there are huge concerns here as well, not necessarily supply chain related, but certainly huge concerns for us. And then we have a world with more questions than answers, which is good, because then we have that job security that Dror talked about, at least if we have some of the answers that other people don't. So both within manufacturing, within supply chain, and for our consumers, all of these questions. Location, are we still all going to be in China in 5 years? Are we going to move to Mexico? Depending on the president. Automation, 3D printing, I think everybody's talked about that. It's huge for us. We're driving an enormous robotics project into almost all of our global plants over the next 4 years. Massive investments in productivity improvements. 3D printing, probably more relevant for us, especially on the spare parts side, could well be a solution to that kind of problems. Standardization, agility, and in the supply chain side, surprise, surprise, visibility is on the top of the agenda. I think we've all talked about that. Sustainability, very big deal for us. Maybe we can touch on that when we're over in the comfortable couches. Dynamic planning, artificial intelligence, blockchain. Huge subject, I think, for everyone involved in global transportation. Can we finally get rid of, you know, the bill of lading? Can we finally get rid of the Seaway bill? Can we finally get rid of the massive amount of documents it really takes to move one container from one part of the world to the other? And how are we going to interface with that whole supply chain? On the consumer side, features, product features, can versus should. Do we really need to have that Wi-Fi enabled oven? Do you really need to put a flat screen TV into the door of your refrigerator? What does that mean for the supply chain? Because it means a lot when we start putting stuff like that into our machines. But we have to. Talked about the smart home. connectivity, and the safety and security. So a lot of questions left, thank God. Where does GT Nexus fit into this for us? Because I suppose it's different for everyone, right? In our day-to-day operations, first of all, tendering, contract management, both for FCL, LCL, and air, we use them. Booking, tracking, reporting, demurrage and detention control via standardized reports that are sent out to hundreds of people every week has helped us cut millions and millions and millions of dollars just in the last 12 months off of our demurrage detention spend by alerting people to heads up, this box is about to go off free time. Massive amounts of money in there to be gained, and happy to share that information with you offline. And then in-transit inventory calibration, so mainly the demand planners are using it to look at how do we orchestrate the flow, do we hold back stuff that we really don't need. Again, not a very dissimilar story to drawers, and why should it be? This is the bread and butter and backbone of supply chain management. Crisis management. So Drawer was very polite. He said that at least we can have some information about what's going on. Yesterday when we were talking about it, he said, we use, in that situation, we use it to figure out how screwed are we. And he didn't use the word screwed either, he used a different one because he's Italian. But that's really the essence of it. How screwed are we? We may not be able to solve the problem, but at least we know what the problem is, and that's been a huge help for us, not just with Hanjin, not just with Maersk, but in every one of those fires, sinkings, collisions, ash clouds, tsunamis, earthquakes, floodings. How screwed are we? If you're able to answer that question, you're halfway to the solution. And we can prioritize decisions, and more importantly, we have one truth. Right, that we can share in our crisis management calls with sometimes hundreds of people around the world. Nobody's discussing, well, my carrier told me something different. Well, I don't care what your carrier told you. This is the truth, and this is the truth we operate to. And that is also worth an enormous amount of money because it's worth an enormous amount of time, and time is money. Finally, acquisitions. Again, we talked about it. We are a serial acquirer. We have grown by acquisition throughout our entire nearly 100-year existence. We have made 6 acquisitions around the world in the last 8 months, both in North America, in South Africa, in Europe, and in Asia. And being able to onboard, we're very often, in my line of business, we're very often the first boots on the ground in an acquisition because it's relatively easy to bring people into what we do. And generally speaking, they don't resist very much because they are almost by definition always smaller than we are, and therefore they can reap huge benefits and savings very quickly. So they usually come willingly into my parlor. They may not come as willingly into the parlor of all the rest of our departments, but that's not a problem. But having GT Nexus allows us to onboard them very, very quickly. It's a huge help. This is the picture I finished with in Miami 4 years ago, which I described as kitchen porn, and I think you can see what I mean. So I thought I would leave you with that, and then I guess we can go to the comfortable couches. Thank you for that.
Have a seat in my studio over here.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
So. I think when we would start, when you and I first got on the phone and talked about this, we touched on Hanjin and Maersk, and there's lots of little things. You said it earlier. There's stuff happening every day.
Oh yeah.
Maybe you could just take a little thing and tell a story about, just the smallest little thing. I mean, we all know about Hanjin, and but yeah. Something small, and what happened, and how did you respond to it, and what were the steps you took to not have a plant shut down or a delivery?
Yeah, so well, I don't know if you described it as a small little thing, but it certainly isn't on the scale of Hanjin or Maersk. About 3 years ago, if I'm not very much mistaken, in Port Klang, the main port in Malaysia, a Hamburg Süd vessel departing the harbor collided with a UASC vessel trying to enter the harbor. Both vessels caught fire quite dramatically. The UASC vessel was towed out to the roads. The Hamburg Süd vessel was towed back to dock, and the fire was extinguished relatively quickly. So I had a call the next morning from our key account manager at Hamburg Süd, I'm not calling out any carrier here. Trust me, if you go back and relook at that map, every carrier has had a vessel on fire. So it's one way to rebalance supply and demand in container shipping. But I got a call from Hamburg Süd, and they said, yes, there was a fire, but don't worry, you only had 9 containers on board, and they're all after Bay 11, which is where the fire stopped. So you should be absolutely fine. We'll get those boxes off in no time, and we'll get them to you. And at that time, because I had read about the fire anyway, I think it was on JOC the night before, I had gone in and pulled a report, and I was like, 9 containers, what the hell are you talking about? I have 119 containers on that ship. Because alliances, right, slot charters, I did not just have Hamburg Süd containers on that ship. I had CMA CGM containers on that ship. I had UAC containers on that ship. I had Maersk containers on that ship. So 119 boxes, which, by the way, represented 50% of the inventory that we were sending to Brazil just in time for Christmas.
Wow.
Yeah, so I've got basically my Brazilian colleagues going, so how? 50% of our Christmas sales basically just sitting in Port Klang. It took some time, and it took some air freight, and it took a lot of footwork from our OEM purchasing guys to replace that cargo, because of course those boxes did not come off the ship. First of all, some of them were in fact forward of Bay 11 and were useless. Secondly, a lot of them were smoke damaged. And thirdly, it took a long time because the ship had to be towed to Singapore for repairs, and they would only offload it down there. So by having the information again available, that is 119 boxes, here's what's in those boxes, here are the suppliers that these boxes came out of, our OEM guys were able to very quickly replenish most of that by buying new stuff in China. Some had to be air freighted, but most of it we got to Brazil in early December, so with still 2 or 3 weeks to go. So I don't know if that's a small thing.
Yeah, well, I mean,
all
right. If you had not been able to do that, what do you think it would have cost you? I mean, what do you think it would have cost the company had you not been able to do that the way you did it?
$50–60 million.
There you go.
Bottom line money, right? At least.
Right, and that's happening every day. Not like
not
that.
every day the vessel catches fire, but there's something every day. Yeah, sure. I mean, it can be accidents, it can be natural disasters, it can be collisions, and sometimes it's not even our fault, right? I mean, it can also happen that we have quality issues that force us to hold back a whole batch of containers so as not to send faulty stuff. Every day there's something,
right?
Which, quite frankly, is what I love about this job.
You're right.
Time.
Right.
But the job becomes a whole lot more lovable when you have access to a tool that at least tells you how screwed you are.
Right. I mean, so I always like to say, oftentimes it's hard to predict when ships are going to collide, right? I mean, so
yeah.
But is there an ongoing aspect to risk mitigation in terms of just bracing yourself? Is there anything you can do? Just because you know it's going to happen, you don't know what or where, but you know something's going to happen. Is there anything you're doing on a regular basis?
The only thing you can do that is diversify your supplier base, right? And not put all your eggs in one basket. That has become also extremely complicated with the advent of these enormous alliances and slot charter arrangements in general. 100% diversifying away all risk is impossible in today's container world. But knowing everything you have and where you have it and what you can divert, and making sure that you do spread yourself, especially on your big lanes, without losing sight of the information, which you would 10 years ago if you said, I have to work with all these carriers, I really don't want to. Now that you have the information at your fingertips for all carriers, makes the decision to diversify the pool of service providers a lot easier,
right,
and more manageable. But that's really the only thing you can do.
Right.
Single sourcing for anything is long gone, and we've had disasters of our own within our own company as well as results of single sourcing that have nothing to do with supply chain management, but everything to do with procurement. So it's just diversification, and I think I agree with a lot of people who have said it's no longer just about getting to the lowest cost. We did that, and we're there. But along the way, you discover that lowest cost, you pay peanuts, you get monkeys, right? And you don't get the service you need. So now it's much more about strategic collaboration with some suppliers, and accepting that sometimes costs a little bit more.
Right. You touched on sustainability. You heard, sustainability's come up a lot. I mean, you heard Steve talking about it earlier on the Shipper Council. I think when I mentioned that to you yesterday at some point, you said we are all over that. I mean, can you talk a little bit about sustainability and logistics and just how you see it and the role and maybe an opportunity for us to forge ahead there?
I can. So we sustainability as a environmentally friendly massive Swedish corporation has been big on our agenda for years, and we've been, for example, an uninterrupted member of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index of the world's most sustainable companies for the last 15 years. We win probably 20 or 30 sustainability awards across the whole enterprise, not just in supply chain, but across the whole enterprise, whether it's manufacturing, procurement, supply chain, logistics. Every year we win tons and tons of awards. We have a sustainability report. In addition to our annual report, we have a target that by 2020 we will cut emissions by 50%. That goal was set in 2014. We have almost done it already. Our plants in Europe now all run only on solar power. We have zero wastewater programs rolled out in 75% of our plants now. On the logistics side, we have, working with carriers, and also, let's be honest, thank you to the carriers for building bigger and more environmentally friendly vessels, cut emissions from ocean transport by 60%, despite that volume growth that you saw there, right? But cutting emissions is not just about running our factories on solar power. It's also about the carbon footprint that is generated when people use our machines, right? So it's also really about inventing more environmentally friendly machines and getting those AAA ratings and stuff like that. But sustainability is huge. We also monitor it for air. We monitor it for land transport in Europe and North America. Working on it in Asia now. It's not so easy to get the data in Asia. But I mean, we've been very vocal about it, and many GT Nexus people in the room will know that we've been pushing for years for GT Nexus to incorporate these kinds of measurements into the tool, and now it seems like it's happening, which is cool.
Right.
So we look forward to it.
Right. I mean, do you think that technology like GT Nexus, visibility, information systems like that are vital to achieving some of the sustainability objectives in logistics and supply chain?
I think so. I mean, there's a whole lot of disparate organizations out there that will track your emissions for you. And one of the problems then becomes finding a methodology that's comparable across all of these, because they all have different standards, different ways of working, and different ways of guesstimating. Because let's be honest, we can't really measure CO2 emissions. We can guesstimate sometimes very accurately, but it's still a guess what they are. I think there's a huge role for GT Nexus to play, adapting one methodology that the Shipper Council or the user group can accept, and then incorporating that into the tool. And potentially we could then get to a point where we could use emission data to make purchasing decisions, right? As you go into your tender. Right now, we've taken a leadership role in the Clean Cargo Working Group. We were very, very active in the Clean Cargo Working Group, which is a big group under BSR. A lot of enormous companies in there. You got your Nikes and your Ikeas, your Heinekens, your H&Ms, your Electroluxes. A lot of BASF is in there. And we have made it a requirement. If you are an ocean carrier and you want to do business with Electrolux and you're not a Clean Cargo Working Group member, then you're not invited. Right? And we do the same thing for green freight and people like that, right? So very important.
Right. Okay.
And we would love to use that data to drive purchasing decisions.
Sure. Similar to the way, before we go here, I've just asked you, I know there's a little bug flying around here. This will not leave you alone, I know. But, kind of looking ahead, you've seen a lot of technology here at this conference as well. I mean, what are some of the things that excite you in the 5-year horizon? This is a good setup for the next panel that's going to come up in a minute.
Artificial intelligence track and trace far beyond ports excites me. I do agree with George. There's a tipping point in the investment required to get to these things, right? It's like, just because I know that my cargo is going to get to the factory half an hour earlier than I thought, is that really worth, can I use that information for some way? Back to that can versus should discussion. But I do think that we do lose track an awful lot of especially ocean containers once they have been discharged. There is kind of a black hole there. And that black hole, by the way, it doesn't start outside the port, it starts inside the port, right? And I've been doing a lot of work on a sub-panel under the Federal Maritime Commission here in New York, in Washington, trying to find out how do we breadcrumb containers all the way from discharge to the factory to find out where the real bottlenecks are. You know, that choke point you're talking about is very often the port. It's not the roads. Right. And getting into that more granular tracking is exciting for me. And beyond that, yes, dynamic AI, I think is not as far away as we think it is. Relative to, for example, making decisions about shifting boxes because we had an incident, where can we find an alternative source of supply? Can we divert? I think that's what excites me.
Right. Well, Bjorn, thank you. Bjorn came all the way from Singapore, flew halfway around the world to sit up here with me today, and I really appreciate your making the trek and contributed to the show. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Greg.